everybody. Hello, C3. Hello, everybody watching from wherever you're watching. We're streaming across YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to see some of your comments, if not all of them. We are here for you to interact with. I'm Karen Huller. I am the co-founder and co-manager of the C3 organization, which is the Corporate Consciousness Co-op. We are a group of professionals, mostly conscious leader practitioners, who are committed to co-creating a more conscious landscape. And Mark Babbitt is here. He has been a member of the C3 committee. He's been a panelist before, and we're here to talk about principles and values in leadership, which seems to be kind of like a grassroots, back to basics type of movement, which I think there's a lot of different offsprings of this movement. So we have, what we call consciousness, conscious leadership. Other people are, it seems, taking a lot of the same principles and values and calling them maybe something different and maybe appealing to new audiences at the same time. And we want to talk about what all the movements that are going on concurrently, how we can even bring them together so that we can work, because it seems like fundamentally we all want the same thing. It might look different, from one group to the next, and we all, in terms of our agendas, might have differences there. But it does appear that, at the basics, we want leaders who can trust. We can trust and who we feel are doing the right thing for the right reasons at the right time. And so Mark Babbitt is with us. He's a culture architect, and he brought actually some of these movements to my notice, and I've been looking into some of them, and he's a little bit more familiar, and I want him to start talking about how he discovered some of these other branches of the same movement, I'll call them, and what he believes the implications are. So welcome, Mark, and thanks for initiating this topic in C3.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, especially on this issue, because, well, you said it so well. There's so many different versions of this now. And one of the reasons that I joined the C3 community was because it was principles and values driven. Mm-hmm. And frankly, me being a startup guy, became infinitely familiar with, I'll just call it a lack of ethics, leaders being focused on the wrong thing, specifically results only. And before I was in the startup world, I did what everybody does when you're in the military. You seek out that big corporate job, and I did that, and frankly didn't last very long for the very same reason, that we were chasing dollar signs instead of pedigree, instead of trust, instead of legacy. And I've worked for myself ever since 1990. I left that corporate job and started doing startups and haven't looked back since. So it's an interesting topic, Karen, in that nobody can help us define what principles and what values mean. Right. Like here, C3, we're so focused on, and we should be, on helping leaders realize how important it is to lead in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And yet, throughout the world, especially, well, I'm just going to say it, since 2016, when a good part of the United States stopped being principles focused, it's been a challenge. It's been divisive. It's been confrontational. It's been stressful. And we started rationalizing really crappy behavior. And that's the opposite of principles and values, right? We set aside our values. Yeah. Yes. We set aside our values.
They see that. Do you just think that they're running by a completely different list of principles and values?
Well, that's it. And that's the point we need to make right off the bat. The people that on the other side of that divisive line, mm-hmm. they strongly believe they're living their values.
Yes.
They strongly believe that their principles are the right principles. And it gets back to the point, we can't help people define what their principles are, what their values are, mm-hmm. right? They aren't even I mean, look at, I suppose the global definition of values or principles is Christian based, or no, not Christian based. Wrong way to say it. Religion based, faith based. And but we look what's going on in the United States, and they're again they strongly believe they're living their ingrained values. But from my perspective, being on the other side of that divide, let's take Christian nationalism as an example, where you exclude people that don't follow your religion. Well, that's the exact opposite of Christian principles, in my view, in my mind. Right?
This is a hard one. This is a hard one because
Yes.
I know so many. I know so many faith-led people who truly believe that their religion is the one true religion, and that it should be dictating for all of us what our principles and values should be. And they see themselves as in alignment with that, and they see everybody else as out of alignment with that, doomed. It's just very much an us versus them, which don't align with my core beliefs. But who's to say that my core beliefs are the right ones either? And so, exactly. I mean, are these principles and values rooted in religion or faith, or are they really the byproduct of us evolving as people to coexist better?
Well, I think they probably are rooted in faith, because that's how we were taught. I'm an old guy, right? I'm 63 years old. So
yeah, I was taught that way as well.
Yeah. So
but a lot of people aren't, yet they still seem to follow principles and values.
So in my family, that was ingrained in me. Mm-hmm. Now I don't practice a specific religion now. I'm not a churchgoer. I still have my beliefs. I still have my faith, but I choose not to actively participate. Right, where my wife is, and my children are all in. Right, so even though we as a family have very strong beliefs, we practice them much differently, each of us. Right, so even with our own family, there's different views on how to live those principles that we were taught as kids, or that at least I was taught as a kid. And now you throw in 24-hour news, you throw in politics, you throw in, look what's happening in Israel versus Hamas right now, right? You throw in all of these things, and it's just so hard to remain focused on what we know is right. Right.
But if we remain focused on what we know is right, and I'm going to put no, right? Because I mean, everybody thinks they know what is right. How do we ever come together? So I guess what I'm starting to believe more and more is that the more flexible we are in our mind view and our worldview, the more we can find commonalities and work together and coexist and collaborate and co-create. And I think that for most of us, I agree. Like I would say my core values and principles have been shaped by my Catholic upbringing, even though I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore. But I know many people who've been atheists for the bulk of their lives, and they still have values and principles. So they're not necessarily determined by or need to be tied to. You can still decide, this is the kind of human being that I want to be. These are the core principles and values that I have to follow in order to be that person, and take it from there, I guess, but if you're in an organization, even the implication that your core values and principles are based on a faith is in itself, by its nature, not necessarily inclusive. Would you agree with that? Disagree with that?
Well, I again, given my upbringing and my version of right versus wrong, we can't be focused on faith. We can't be pushing our faith on others and exclude others at the same time. That's a contradiction to me. Right. And that in particular rubs me the wrong way, because I am politically conservative. I'm fiscally conservative. I never voted for one party. I voted for the right person at the right time. right? So I'm not a Democrat, I'm not Republican, but there's an entire party in the United States that's been taken over by this willingness to compromise what we believe and what they used to believe was right versus wrong.
But don't you think they're just justifying their decisions based on what they? Yeah.
Yes.
So how do we reconcile that? Can we reconcile that? Is this counter movement? How do we serve this counter movement so that even if we're not in alignment on fiscal or political policies, we're still in alignment on the principles and values?
Yeah, my answer to that question, Karen, is I can't help people realign. I can only live my values. I can only run my company according to our values. And as a consultant and an author, my job is to help leaders live their values and not just live them, but define them.
Yeah.
So everybody in the company knows exactly. Let's just take the value integrity, for example.
Right.
One of the reasons that I got into this line of work is I was working with a CEO as an executive consultant and a coach, and he said, "Well, I'm going to lay off 10% of my workforce. I have to. It's the investors insist on it." I said, "Okay, how are you picking the bottom 10%? Is it based on results? Is it based on personality? Is it based on the group they work for? Is it based on whether they're liked or not?" And he goes, "I don't know yet." And I said, "Well, okay, so let me help. How this usually works is the bottom 10% of results driven metrics, they're gone."
Yeah.
Right? Let's just take sales, for example. You can have the best values aligned person in the world, and if they're in the bottom 10%, they're probably going to get laid off.
Right.
But you have the top 3% of sales, they're almost always alpha males. They're almost always sexist. They're almost always loud and obnoxious. They are that typical, used car salesman kind of mentality thing. And they're absolutely destructive to a values-led company.
Yeah.
Right? They don't live the values. They don't model the values. They don't even try to align to the values, yet they're going to remain. And the other people that are values-driven are going to be laid off. Right?
Yeah.
And so I asked him to seriously consider what that meant. And I said, for example, you say his ultimate answer was, "So you're telling me to lay off the people that aren't aligned to our values?" I said, "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there has to be a balance. You have to balance those that are doing pretty well on performance-driven in the matrix and aligned. You don't want to have people that are just values aligned. If they're crappy at their job, they got to go. Right. So you got to find that balance." And he goes, so he came back the next day, Karen, and he said, "I've made up my mind. We always talk about values in our company. It's a poster on the wall. And I'm going to lay off the people that everybody thinks are jerks. And I'm going to lay off the people that aren't doing their job." I said, "Okay, define jerks."
Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, it just anecdotal. Yeah, not acceptable.
Yeah.
Not acceptable. Because you can't define jerks until you define what makes them jerks. And you can't do that because you haven't actually defined your values. Yes, you have 6 words up on a poster. And one of those words is integrity. Okay. If I go to your crew right now and I ask 20 people what integrity means to them, I will get 19 different answers. Because you haven't defined what integrity means at this company.
Yeah.
Right. And so.
Yeah. A lot of them are subjective.
So he ended up, just to bring the story full circle, not laying off anybody. He had to go back to the investors and go, "I have no real world criteria for deciding who I'm laying off."
Wow.
So we're going to do a 10% across the board budget cut, but I can't, with living my values, and this is December 5th, December 6th, living my values, I can't lay off 10% of my crew right before Christmas. I can't live that.
Wow.
And so he did. He implemented a 10% across the board budget cut. Everybody went, "Okay, at least we still have jobs."
Yeah.
Right. Then we began defining values, and we didn't just define values in a Webster dictionary way. We said, okay, great, but
what does it look like, right?
what does it look like? Like
yeah.
right here within this workforce, what does it look like? For instance, somebody's not living the integrity value. How would you know that? How would you observe that? And so we started defining the actual value, and we define it in behavioral terms.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, one of the behavioral terms that we came up with, was Mark does what he says he will do. So if I, as a leader, make a promise to you as an employee and I don't keep that promise, I'm not living the integrity value. Right? And then, okay, great. How do we measure that? Right? You can observe it certainly, but how do you measure that? Well, then we started doing surveys, 1 to 6. Does, we 360 review, let's call it, that way back then. Does Mark do what he says he will do? Well, if I'm only getting a 2 out of 6, I'm not living that value.
Right.
But if I'm getting a 5 or 6, now I'm living the value. Well, now, and this is a very specific example in the corporate world, and I completely get it, but now we're observing and we're measuring and we're living the values, right? And we know whether we're living the values or not. Right? Now, apply that same logic to news organizations, to political parties, to candidates.
I always thought there should be a scoring system.
That's the point, Karen. There's no scoring system.
I know.
Right? And
there should be.
If we ask somebody what they think of Fox News versus CNN, we get that answer. I prefer Fox News because it's more aligned with my values.
I think when we first started talking, I told you about the consciousness quotient, which is a system I was devising to help score
to measure
organizations on a consciousness level. Yeah. And I still have the framework somewhere. I never took it as far as I wanted to because life happened in the middle of everything. But I still strongly believe that the way that we approach how to align people with values and principles in an organization should be the same way that people assess whether they're going to work for a company, whether they're going to be consumers of a company's products. Just knowing how they score on their own spoken values.
Right.
It would really hold a mirror up to a lot of organizations, I think.
Well, my encouragement would be to revive that in whatever form that becomes, because it is sorely needed in this world. I mean, we and not just at work. We have as a society
something we can co-create in C3.
Yes. Yeah. And even at home, we know several families that are struggling with nimble values. We know social groups that are definitely struggling with nimble values, right? And the trouble with that, Karen, as soon as we compromise, all of a sudden we're not living that value anymore. We rationalized that it's okay not to live that value in this moment. And you know what? We all do it, not judging. But if you do it over time, we have to realize, okay, so I guess that's no longer one of our values.
Right.
Look at sexism in the workplace. Look at gender-based treatment in the workplace.
I have been immersed in all of that.
This has been going on for decades.
Yeah.
Right. And we have not moved that needle one little bit. Right. Look at the lack of female representation in the C-suite, in the boardroom. Right. We know better. And all the data tells us that if we are a values-based company that is truly equal opportunity for everybody, that our profits go up, our performance goes up, our employee retention goes up, right? People don't leave because this is a great company to work for, whether you're a male or a female. And we're just using female as one example here. Right. But, and yet 7% of board seats are filled by women. International. Somebody's not living that value. And fine, then you've proven, you've demonstrated, and now we've documented that that's clearly not a value. You claim it to be. The About Us page on your website says it is. No, it's not. And
besides having the principles and having the metrics to score them, they also need a way to, get that feedback in live time to create a culture where everybody has permission to call somebody out for being out of alignment with the principles and values established by an organization. I feel like women in the moment, right, when they're experiencing microaggressions or discrimination, or they weren't granted a raise for a position that 3 men had just gotten before them, to be able to speak up and say, hey, by the way, this equity thing you've been talking a lot about, it's not being practiced right now. And I don't think a lot of companies, that's probably a harder thing, because leaders will have to be completely humble, accountable, transparent. They have to have their egos severely in check if they're going to say anybody and everybody can call us out, right, for anywhere the organization is out of alignment with values. And then have a way for that to be reported safely.
Yeah. Most leaders are not that strong, especially old white male leaders are not that strong. That's been my experience. Is we say all the right things, and you see these Fortune 100 leaders, and they're interviewed by the news or the business networks, and they say, they're cornered. They're told, well, only 14% of your director and above are women in your company. Can we talk about that? Oh, they have a speech planned. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Here's what we're doing to fix that.
Carefully written by their communications,
right?
I'm sure.
And if you go back and look 10 years ago, that he probably said the exact same thing, maybe to a different company, but he probably said the exact same thing. He had the planned response, and in the meantime, he's not doing anything about it.
Right, no action.
Right, so he's not being held accountable. And by the way, in our line of work, and in our newest book, we spend a third of the book talking about, okay, great, you defined your culture in behavioral terms. We can now observe and measure whether somebody's living those attributes or not, right? And great, what happens when your top salesperson isn't living those values at all?
Yeah.
And you let him stay. You don't retrain him. You don't help make him more self-aware so he knows he's telling racist or sexist jokes. You matter of fact, Karen, and I know you've seen this in the corporate world, the chances are that top salesman is going to be made the next manager. Even though he's got no leadership qualities at all, and he's not well respected by his team,
and
he's the top salesman. So we're probably going to make him the next leader.
Right.
And it's completely counter to the culture, to the values that we've defined. And so
and he's going to teach his team how to do exactly what he did, which is also out of alignment. It's a domino effect, but it can also be a domino effect in the other. That one leader who said, I'm not going to lay off any of my team members. I'm going to do a 10%. I'll bet that was completely reinforcing for.
Oh, it was. And that leader went on to do absolutely amazing things because people knew he genuinely cared about not just the employees, but their families in that moment right before Christmas. And he made that decision. And he stood up in the cafeteria almost in tears and said, being completely vulnerable, completely transparent. This is the advice I got. This is the path we were going down, and I couldn't do it. And he teared up and said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it to you. And from that moment on, in that moment of vulnerability, in that moment of transparency and accountability, people fell in love with the company all over again.
I'm sure engagement went sky high. I'm sure turnover went way low. I'm sure productivity went up. I'm sure
all because he lived his, and it was a very personal value, by the way. And he and I have talked about this 100 times since it happened 20 years ago. You hadn't yet defined your values. That was your personal value.
Yeah.
You chose not to lay off people right before Christmas.
Right.
It eventually became a company value, right? Because you lived it, you modeled it.
What
It
do they
became
call it? How did they measure it?
they
What do they
called
call
it
it?
accountability.
Okay.
Like, for instance, he said, we're underperforming. The investors are actually angry at me, but they can't replace me between now and Christmas.
Right.
So because you're angry at me, I have to lay off 10% of my workforce. Well, why didn't I think about this 6 months ago? Why didn't I hold myself accountable for turning this around 6 months ago? Right. And so he said, if I'm not holding myself accountable, how do I lay off other people? And so they refer to it as accountability. And by the way, I will tell you now, about 80% of the companies that Chris Edmonds and I, my business partner, work with, following what we call good comes first mentality, about 80% of them have accountability as one of their main company values.
I was looking at the list of principles and values for this principle first movement, and they really closely resemble everything we've been talking about: ethical
Exactly.
leadership, transparency,
Exactly. And
inclusivity,
yep.
stewardship, adherence to the rule of law, accountability, continuous improvement, respect for human dignity. Like, those are all things I believe in too. So it really looks like we're,
Yeah. And here's the cool thing about what you just mentioned, and I'm very glad you mentioned principles first. I know when you and I were talking about having this conversation, we brought them up as an example. This is an organization within the political spectrum that has said, no more of this bull. No, we're going to define our values, and regardless of the cult-like candidate that might come along, we're going to live our values. And if that means that we need to vote for somebody from the other party because he more closely lives our values, or because she better models our values, then we're not doing this, two-party system, Republican versus Democrat and all that. We're going to we're going to recommend that people vote for the person who more closely models our values.
So have they gone as far as you go with your clients in terms of not just identifying the values, but going through all of the observable behaviors and finding a way to measure them? Do they do that?
Not yet. It's very much a political movement. And we learned, from working with.
Time is kind of ticking in terms of.
Well, yeah, that's it. Well, but let's keep things in perspective. This new movement has only been alive for 8 years, right? And it's very new to us. It's very new to all of us. I know people, and maybe you do too, Karen, that say, I just can't watch the news anymore. It's so negative. It's so divisive.
I get AP notifications, but I don't watch them anymore.
Yep. And I do the same thing from NPR. But even NPR, some people that are listening to this conversation right now will say, oh, that's a liberal rag, blah, blah, blah. But NPR has been ranked over and over again as the most objective news source possible. AP is second, by the way. So good choice. But it's not CNN. It's not Fox. It's not Newsmax. Right. It's not, some liberal spin. They at least try to live their values. And to the point that one of their big editors the other day, you probably saw it in the news, said, we're not living our values right now. And I can't be a part of it anymore. I'm out of here.
I did see
and
that.
He called them out. And he left, right? So it's no, the principles first, although I think they have tremendous power in a values or principles based organization. They haven't yet got to the measurement part. Everything is anecdotal still, right? And
when it's anecdotal, it's so subjective, though. Anybody can say, like, I mean, to me, it would look just like all the other debates online between keyboard warriors who just, whataboutism. Like, that's what it looks like to me. And until you have, and that's why you have the system that you have with your clients, because until you really define them, there's no clear way to say for certain how aligned you are with your values and principles. Right. Yeah.
Well, you and I both know whataboutism is a direct result of divisive politics, right? And divisive cultures, right?
Yeah.
It's also, even to be more specific, whataboutism happens when people are absolutely not held accountable for living their values. I mean, yeah, we get the poster on the conference room walls, and we get the nice script, frame thing in the lobby. And if you ask us about it, we could probably name 3 out of our 8 values off the top of our head. We don't exactly have memorized, right? Well, then they're not part of your culture. After we go through our values-driven exercise, we have companies. We'll be sitting there with them, and they'll have a very heated discussion, which is okay. It's okay as long as we're still respectful. We encourage healthy debate, right? Because otherwise things get pushed under the rug and all that. So we don't mind it when clients with us in the room are getting a little animated, a little passionate about what they believe.
Yeah.
Because that's how values are formed, right? Or ignored, depending on how, the perspective.
Yeah.
And we'll have people we have this one company in Seattle, and a union shop of all things, right? I mean, you can't get any more blue collar than this company. And they went through this exercise because they were failing on the values front. And we sit there with them in a conference room, and they'll go, I could see you're trying really hard right now to live number 4. So I'm going to too. I don't like it right now, but I see you're trying. So I'm going to try too. Right. And it's like life changing. It's as soon as you define the values, and somebody, let's just say they go to name calling, or they go to whataboutism or whatever. Well, somewhere, if you've defined your values, those things are not okay. Right. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if it's number 4, number 7, or number 11. You got to look up on that wall and go, dang it, I am not living that value right now, and it's pissing me off. Right. But I'm self-aware because I'm driven by values within that organization. I'm self-aware enough to know I'm not living that value right now. Right. Or maybe it's the next morning. Right. Maybe it's the next morning. You go, dang it. I got really mad in that meeting yesterday, and I didn't live that value. And so what happens when you go in, you sit down with that person, you go, I'm so sorry. I wasn't living our values yesterday.
Right.
Now you're proving to whoever was in that meeting, or whoever was the target of the, non-aligned behavior, I am holding myself accountable. Yeah. I had a weak moment yesterday, but I am holding myself accountable, and I apologize. And we got to let's go back to being focused on solutions.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, we talk about this a lot. It's amazing what happens not only when you define your values, like Principles First has, like other organizations outside the political spectrum have. When you not just hold yourself accountable, but you make that leap into self-awareness. And now it's like, right. And it's not just
uncomfortable, isn't it? We talk about that all the time. Yep. That's the work. The work is being able to be with yourself when you realize that you have not been operating under your own values, and then being able to be like, and to not make it a, something that changes who you are, to recommit. You have to own it, communicate that, and recommit. That's the hardest part. It takes something, because gosh, I know that if I learn that I've done something that unintentionally harmed someone or caused them hardship or trauma, oh my gosh, that's like the worst feeling in the world, to be with. And you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, to quote something Lawrence always said, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because that is the work of being a leader. You have to be with the ways that you've been wrong or wronging people.
Yeah. And by the way, I know we took a very corporate company culture slant to this, but imagine how much better off families would be if parents gave their kids permission to say, what happened yesterday is not okay with me. It didn't sit well with me. That takes a certain maturity. I'm not sure you could go to a 6-year-old, unless you drag it out of them. They're probably not going to say, hey, what happened yesterday wasn't right. But a teenager is certainly capable of that, right? A young adult is certainly capable of saying, that didn't work for me yesterday. And so, but again, we're talking about, vulnerability, transparency, self-awareness, emotional intelligence. we're talking about all these things that 24-hour news is just beating the crap out of us for, and telling us if we're not angry, if we're not on one side of this topic or the other, if we're not angry about that, something's wrong with us.
Right.
And they're, it's like they're trying to get us to take a stand, which if we're going to live a values-driven life, if we're going to run a values-driven company or political party or whatever, yes, you eventually have to take a stand. But in the meantime, there's something to be said for, my goodness, she really feels really strongly about that. And it would help me to understand why.
Yeah.
Right. And you've probably seen this there on a social media site. There's this recurring videos of people that voted for one candidate in the last presidential election that say they're never going to vote for that person again. Right. And it's pervasive. It's a huge multi-million-dollar campaign. And all it is usually older, usually white people that have drawn their line in the sand. And they're living their values. And I can completely appreciate that we're asking people to create these video testimonials.
Yeah.
And live their piece now.
Yeah.
But I want to go to each one of those people and go, how nimble were your ethics, were your values, with your principles 4 years ago, 8 years ago? What did you believe then that you don't believe now? Because nobody's asking that question. Nobody's trying to understand why people are nimble with their values. And if we don't work to understand that, if we just vilify that person, we're no longer living our values.
I think to some level, right, these are adults, so they're responsible for their own decisions. But we also see how manipulative and how the tools that we use to communicate every day have been used as weapons to manipulate the way people look at a situation or fear things. It's textbook, really, when you look at history, that this is used. So I don't personally want to vilify anybody who thought differently before and were out of alignment with their true values. I want to reinforce for the people who have decided, who've drawn that hard line in the sand. And I guess this campaign is really the way to do it, right? I mean, to say, here are some other people who are willing to admit that however they felt 4 years ago or 8 years ago or whoever it was, we're not feeling that way now. It seems very similar to the way that you would take somebody who, didn't know better, a child even, and then they grow up and they realize, oh, I shouldn't have done that. You don't want to harp on what they didn't know then. You just want to be like, great, okay, how can we? And really, because you're right. We should be saying what is different now. If these folks who change their mind could be able to have those frank conversations with other people to figure out, like, what is the difference? How can they make the difference to other people? How can their conversion to greater alignment with their values convert other people to be in greater alignment with their values?
Right. Well, and let's talk about how these movements are made, right? Let's talk about this Principles First, this political organization again. They deliberately strove to seek out like-minded people. Even before they defined their values, they said, I believe you feel the same way I do about what's going on in politics right now. So let's go have a beer. Literally what happened. Well, then beer turns into a happy hour. And now instead of 4 people there, there's 40 people there. Right. And then happy hour turns into a day-long meeting. Now there's 400 people there. Now they have a summit. Now there's 4,000 people there. And not just any 4,000 people. They have Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, all of these people that had to, over the course of the last 4 years or so, choose to live their values. And I'm not saying their values are any better than anybody else's. Again, we can't define that.
Mm-hmm.
But these are two politicians who had to choose to live their personal values or support their political party. And they both had to leave the political party. They were forced out because they chose to live their values. Well, now who's keynoting this 4,000 person event? Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like-minded people.
Yeah.
And so it's completely grassroots, almost spontaneous. And now there's chapters in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Washington, D.C., of course, and Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become this very interesting way to say, I'm not going to get sucked in. And you said it so good, Karen. Look at history, right? For those of you listening, I'll encourage you to read a book. It was actually recommended to me very recently by a man that's worked for me for 20 years, or with me for 20 years, and it's called On Tyranny. And On Tyranny is a historical look at what happens when societies become divisive.
Mm-hmm.
When a certain faction gains power by polarizing people within a community,
Mm-hmm.
by making them choose one side or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there are references to 1930s Germany and all that, which I know it's very cool right now to, people on one side say, well, you're being fascist, and people on the other side is, well, you're creating tyranny, right? And you make me wear a mask, so you're the one being a fascist, not me, right? And there's all, again, how do we define values? We don't, right? But On Tyranny takes a very close look at what happens when political leaders over the course of, from Roman days on, have chosen divisiveness, polarity, instead of inclusiveness, and the road that's led people down, and how it almost never works out.
Yeah.
Right? It works in that moment because I'm going to divide people, hoping 51.3% of them vote for me, and completely alienate the other 48.7% because I don't care.
And that's the focus on results we were talking about. It's the same thing. If you're an organization purely focused on sales results, profit, and you don't look at any of your other values in play as a holistic system, then you're bound to have a culture that stresses results over all else.
Yeah, there's a real world example of this, and it's fairly recent, and we don't have to name company names. But there's a production company in Hollywood, and their entire thing was they were children-based and family-based. That was their thing. And it was pointed out to the leader of that company that he didn't have any women writers in anywhere. Like, out of you're family-driven and you're children-driven, but you have 0 women writers in the writers' room. So he invited 2 women writers and pulled them aside, to fix the problem, pulled them aside and said, I only have compensation for 1 writer, so you and the other female are going to split the salary, and you have to be okay with that or you can't be here. Well, talk about lack of self-awareness, lack of ethics, lack of principles, right? No male was asked to split salaries. Right? Well, of course it eventually gets out. And so what does the leader do instead of owning it? He goes to the press, he goes to his friends, his allies, his supporters, and says, oh, she's just being a victim. She's working against us now, so she can't be here anymore. And then both writers are fired. One quit, one was fired. Right? But of course it got out.
Yeah.
Right? So you say you're family oriented, you say you're children focused, and yet you have this going on behind the scenes?
It's curious how a person gets to such a point that they truly believe that they can make any decision without suffering any consequences for it.
Well, we're living that in our political world right now.
That's the danger of not having accountability.
Yep, that's it.
That you get people who completely believe that they are above any consequences for any bad decisions or any harm that they do.
Well, and what kind of system, what kind of socioeconomic policies put a person like that in power?
Yeah.
I mean, how did we get where we are now? Right, in our political world, how did we devolve from now? Grant, the first time I voted was, I told you I'm old, 1980, right? I mean, I'm in the military serving my country, and it's my first time I get to vote, mostly because I had my 18th birthday in boot camp. I went in the military when I was 17, and so the election comes along the next November, and I had to choose between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And Jimmy Carter was the most civil. I mean, look how highly revered he is now, right? Maybe not a great president at that time, with inflation and interest rates and all the Iran-Contra affair, or the Iran-Contra affair that turned out to be from the hostage situation. Maybe he wasn't a great president, but he was a good man. He was a principles, values-based man. And then you had this actor, Ronald Reagan. Yeah, he was governor of California, but he didn't have the pedigree that Jimmy Carter had. Well, people voted for Ronald Reagan because interest rates were at 18.5% or something like that at the time. And Ronald Reagan went on to create his own legacy, again, depending on what your political spectrum is, whether it's positive or negative.
Yeah.
But my point is, Karen, I got to choose between two decent men, right? And now go to 2016, and we didn't have that choice. Go to 2020, we didn't have a choice of two decent people, right? Go to 2024, where again, we're not choosing between two decent people, and now we can focus our election, our votes on policy. Now we're being focused to choose. We're being forced to choose on character.
I'm just reliving for a moment. Just give me a moment here to just relive for a second the shock and awe of realizing that a TV personality and real estate mogul who'd been known to be discriminatory and be,
sexist, misogynistic.
I mean, it's just how did we get here? And I remember in 11th grade, I had a social studies teacher who really got me more civically engaged than any teacher before, and got me thinking about careers that would be a contribution in some way. And what we learned about the media, and we learned about yellow journalism, and we learned how the media had been abused in other countries, and how in our country it was supposed to be part of our system of checks and balances. I wanted to be a journalist. That was, something that I put on the list of things that I wanted to be, because I believed at the time that it was a way to contribute to this system of checks and balances. And when I watched it unfold, I was like, this guy knows the media, and he is utilizing it while at the same time sowing distrust in it. And at the same time, the media wasn't necessarily helping itself either, and I think we can actually go back to Reagan to understand why reporting had become so biased as well. But, so when I look back at that, it seemed to me that's how it all started, right? This is how we receive our information. He's leveraging that. But then I think to myself, there also had to be some denigration of values as a country to get to the point where we believe that this person is the better person.
Despite all their flaws. Despite all the flaws, this person is better. I mean, I saw a post on social media last week, and it was It was the former president standing up outside the courtroom saying, I should be with my wife on her birthday today. Well, you're not with your wife on her birthday because you're defending yourself for having affairs with a porn star and a former Playmate of the Year.
How did
And yet
how did a country vote for someone?
Right. And again, God, it's so hard to have. Let's face it, it's really hard right now, Karen, to have a conversation, just two of us talking with, and people obviously listening. It's hard to have a conversation about ethics and principles without using our current political situation to help illustrate those, right?
I know. We were totally like, we're going to leave politics out of it as much as possible.
That didn't work.
But it's you have
but
to
it
look
is
at
the
all
glaring
the examples of leadership. It is. I know.
Right.
Right.
And so right when I'm thinking this, and this is my point, right when I'm thinking this, my 17-year-old comes out of the kitchen and I have the TV on, and it's the former president talking about how he can't be with his third wife on her birthday. Mm-hmm. And my 17-year-old says, wait a minute. Isn't this the hush money thing? Thank God you get it, because I didn't want to have to explain it. Right. So
and yet people overlook it. It's just how do you,
but then we get
how do you sympathize with them? I just have to believe that it's like some kind of disease of thinking, like
I think it's very, see, here's what else happens when we hold ourselves accountable to our view of principles, right? It's very easy to then want to hold others accountable to our sets of values.
True.
Right. True. And that's essentially what's happening throughout the United States right now.
Yeah.
Right. People on both sides.
Yeah.
There are people who believe I don't care anything about porn stars and Playmates of the Year.
Yeah.
And you fooled around with her while your wife was pregnant and the other one 2 months after your youngest baby was born. And I'm a Christian, mm-hmm. and all of that's okay with me because inflation is 3.9% and that's unacceptable. Mm-hmm. Okay, then. Yeah. You just defined what was important to you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do my best not to judge you on that.
It's so hard.
while living my own values. Because the fact is, I want somebody in the White House, in this example, that is character driven, that lives a certain set of ethics. And by the way, I said at the beginning of our talk, I am not a Democrat. I am not liberal in any shape or form, mm-hmm. but living my values, I had to vote for Joe Biden because mm-hmm. I couldn't have somebody that I perceived as having a significant lack of character. I could not cast my vote for that person and live my values.
Yeah.
So and it sounds like we're trying to judge it.
Well, to use another example, I was in 1992, I was in high school and my mom was trying to decide who to vote for. And this was, maybe I'm getting fuzzy on the years, so don't hold me to it. But, Clinton had already been not indicted, but he was impeached and the people voted for him again. I can see that kind of being a similar mirror, right?
Yep.
I mean, I'm not going to say that all Democrats are ethical and aligned with my values. I'm certainly not going to say that. I would not have voted for Clinton again in that election if I was old enough to. When my mom did, I was like, what? Really? I like him. She's like, I like him. He's charming, so we it's not like we haven't been here before. We maybe haven't been to this extreme, but we must have been heading there.
Yeah, but here's the difference. And if you don't mind me saying this, mm-hmm. go back to 2010. John Edwards is the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. Mm-hmm. Word got out that he had fathered a child out of wedlock.
Yep, remember that.
And word got out eventually that he covered it up.
Right.
and it drove him out of politics.
Yeah.
Karen, that was only 14 years ago.
Right. Well, Cuomo, like nothing had been proven either, but the Democrats said you got to go.
Yeah,
right?
You can't go because you're not aligned with our principles and our values, and nobody's going to vote for you. Right?
Yeah.
You can't be the leading candidate representing our party because you didn't align to our values or our perceived values, right?
So maybe lessons are learned, but
so just 14 years ago, we completely drummed, other than this affair, what appeared to be a really good man and a good politician and a decent leader. We drummed him completely out of politics.
Yeah.
For what our former president is going to court right now for, and he's still the leading candidate for his party.
Yeah.
So, and all of that is to emphasize the point you made. What happened to us? When did we as a society stop living our principles? When did we stop living our values? When did we stop defining our values?
And who for us as a country is going to do that now? That's what I want to know.
I'm telling you,
right?
this is why we talk about groups like Principles First. This is why we talk about the podcasts and the books that I'm leaning toward now. I'm actually finding, and maybe we can make a list of these and put them on the website, Karen. There's podcasts and there's blogs and there's these amazing people that like Principles First, like the leaders that my company is working with, that are taking a stand, not based on religious values, not based on other people's values, but what works for me and my community, my company. There are people that are making this stand based on principles and ethics that are going to change the world back to where at least it used to be. It wasn't perfect, but at least it was, I don't know.
We had standards.
It was more fulfilling. It was more peaceful. People, you could go to bed at night knowing you did the right thing, feel good about that.
The peace of mind, right?
That's the word. That's the phrase I was looking for.
Yeah.
No, we weren't perfect. When Clinton did his thing, no, we weren't perfect. When Edwards did his thing, going all the way back to Nixon, the Nixon thing shook our world.
Yeah.
Right. And now Nixon would probably be the front runner because nobody cares about ethics and values anymore.
Right.
Think about that.
Yeah.
The guy who was forced to resign based on a break-in, not adulterous affairs, not insurrections, not hiding, declaring classified documents as personal property.
Yeah.
Right. He orchestrated a break-in and he was completely forced to resign from his office as president of the United States. And now look at all the crap we're tolerating now.
And he also, complied with that wish.
And he walked away.
We have somebody now that I don't know. I mean, I do know, and it scares me, but
it's I'm so glad you asked me to have this conversation because it's a tough conversation to have.
Yeah.
There are people out there I know that completely disagree with me.
Sure.
And that's got to be okay.
Right.
I'm not asking them to live my values. I'm insisting that I live my values. Right.
Yeah.
And define your values, stick to it, and don't compromise. Don't tolerate. Even in company culture, Karen, we say this all the time. We will look at a leader and we will say, so you knew what he was doing was wrong, right, leader? They go, yeah, I knew it. And you tolerated it. And that his behaviors became you tacitly gave permission for him to be like that. And
then other people follow that permission as well.
Right. So you, for just a moment, maybe you tolerated, you compromised your values. So you're not really living your values. Not only is he not living your values, but now you're not.
Right.
Right. And that becomes contagious. Right. Well, guess what? Living your values, living principles is contagious too. And that's what is happening now. And that's what you said at the start of our conversation. There's all these different branches now, political, non-political, community-based, faith-based, family-based,
Yeah.
There's all these branches of everything that C3 is trying to do, just saying it in their own words,
Yeah.
because people are done. People are done compromising on their values. And that's what you and I are here to talk about.
And I want to be clear, speaking for the C3 community, that we are not trying to compete with people who want the same end goals. We would much rather collaborate. So if you are a member of, a representative of any of these organizations who are striving to return to a world where we had principled and principled leaders with values that resonate with the majority of us, just who will stick to their values, then join our organization. Reach out to me. Let's co-create. Let's collaborate. Let's get on the same page. Let's move this forward as quickly as possible so that we can prevent any further damage and denigration.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Mark, thanks for bringing Principles First to my awareness. I've enjoyed diving in. It gives me a lot of hope and promise. I don't align really politically with some of the people that are there, but just to know that we can align on these basic things does give me a more optimistic view of the future.
Well, maybe, and that's such a great way to end the conversation, is when you have devout liberals that are joining Principles First, not because it's a conservative organization, certainly not because somebody like Adam Kinzinger or Liz Cheney are being their keynotes, but just because they're starving for principle-driven leadership. That's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks again, Mark. I appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody who watched, who will watch. If you're here and you watched the replay, make a comment. I have underneath my name here that you can't really see too well. I don't know if you'll see me, but maybe you'll see that link.
The link is there.
To join the C3 community and reach out to me. Reach out to Mark. We all want the same thing, so let's work together. Thanks again, Mark. Happy end of April. Welcoming May. We'll see what's on the docket for May in the C3 community. I'm looking forward to co-creating more.
Thank you, Karen.
Take care.